We are very excited and privileged to announce a settlement today that is truly a landmark settlement. It is the largest settlement ever with an automaker. It is the largest settlement ever in the context of the Clean Air Act and in the context of enforcement of our environmental laws. And this settlement also, and I confess with a bit of bravado as a proud Californian, is really about the best of California. This settlement also represents the best of what we do in these positions, where we hold the public trust. This is about California agencies working together in partnership, collaboratively, to achieve the best results for Californians and by extension for the country. I want to especially thank Mary Nichols. She is the chairwoman, and she's going to speak with you in a moment, from the California Air Resources Board that we call CARB. I have known her for years, worked with her for years, and I will tell you we are so lucky in California to have her here. She is a nationally recognized expert on all of these issues, and in particular the role of government in terms of regulation and in terms of creating standards that are at our highest around what we do to protect our environment. So, Mary, I just want to thank you publicly, as I hope I have often enough privately, for your leadership and your work. I also want to recognize some of the folks in my office who really have been doing this work tirelessly around the clock for quite some time. I want to start with Nick Akers. He is a true and incredible public servant. He has been leading a lot of our efforts in this office on behalf of consumers, and this is just the latest of your great hits. Thank you, Nick, for your work. I also want to recognize Judy Fiorentini and David Zanona and John Worm for their work and their leadership. So here's what we've got. This is a case that basically, as I said, is a landmark deal for Californians. It includes billions of dollars in consumer relief and funding for environmental projects going forward that will include a focus on what we need to do to improve zero emissions in terms of the technology that is available. So today we filed in federal district court an unprecedented $14.7 billion agreement holding Volkswagen accountable because they installed what has been called a defeat device, which is software that it installed in its 2.0-liter diesel cars. And evidence proved that it significantly then harmed California consumers and our environment. Essentially what happened is Volkswagen programmed software in its diesel cars to operate more cleanly while they were undergoing emissions testing. However, in the normal driving conditions, the cars were spewing harmful pollutants into the air and up to 40 times the legal limit under California and federal law. The way that I think about this case is that, in essence, VW cheated on the test and they got caught. And essentially what they were doing on a daily basis is flunking California's high standards every day. And again, they got caught. So let's start by recognizing this in terms of what this means for California. One, we should say with pride, California consumers are conscientious consumers. California consumers care about their environment. And so the consumers who were then harmed directly by VW's false advertising were individuals who actually wanted to purchase a car that would not harm our environment, or at least would not contribute to harm. And so in essence, what we know is this. Between 2009 and 2015, 71,000 vehicles were purchased by California consumers who were misled by VW into thinking their purchase was not only a smart investment, but also eco-friendly. In an October 2008 press release, VW claimed, and I quote, "The Jetta TDI is among the 10 most fuel-efficient vehicles on the U.S. market. Moreover, the Jetta Clean TDI also fulfills stringent California emission standards." That was patently false. California was uniquely impacted by their conduct, in that these defeat devices both affected a large, and in fact the largest number of consumers of any state, and because California laws set the standard here and across the country. That's why we conducted our own independent investigation. And again, I cannot say enough the role and the leadership role that CARB played in this. It was they who were on the ground from the first moment that this was discovered, who was doing the investigation, who was applying the law to the facts to do what we were ultimately able to do in terms of reaching this settlement. And it reminds me, frankly, of in my office the work that we did years ago in dealing with the 5 big banks of the United States and what we needed to do in terms of going our own way, going an independent way, representing California consumers, knowing that we are unique in many ways. So as part of the deal that we have negotiated, there are a couple of aspects. One, $10 billion will be required of VW to spend compensating consumers, tens of thousands of whom are right here in California. And in particular, that amount will be required to either buy back the cars or modify or scrap at least 85% of these vehicles nationwide and in California. If VW falls short of the national or California target, the company must pay for additional environmental projects. $4.7 billion of the settlement will go to fix the market that they manipulated and to mitigate the environmental harm that it caused. Of this, California will receive 1/4 of the total sum, which equals about $1.1 billion. Of the $4.7 billion, $2.7 billion will go to a fund to support environmental programs nationwide, with California receiving $380 million, which is 14% of the overall funding. CARB, we're very excited to tell you, and Mary Nichols will share more, is going to direct this funding towards the mitigation programs in California. And again, of the $4.7 billion, the remaining $2 billion will be required to be invested over the next 10 years in zero emissions technologies, and basically to rectify the impact of falsifying emissions results in California. And 40% of that amount of the $2 billion will come to California, so that's $800 million. And those investments will happen right here in California. In terms of consumer relief, consumers who bought or leased these cars before the fraud came to light will be offered compensation for the company's deception. The 2.0-liter clean diesel vehicles covered by the deal include Beetles, Golfs, Jetta, and Passats, and range from the years of 2010 through 2015. The consumers have a choice, and they can either opt into the buyback program or potentially receive modification to their car. Consumers opting for a buyback or a modification will be offered a cash payment of at least $5,000 and as much as $10,000 on top of the fair market value of their car. To find out more, we ask consumers to go to a website, which is vwcourtsettlement.com. And there they will find the general information about the settlement, but also they can input their VIN, their vehicle identification number, and get more specific information about the relief they're entitled to receive. And then in closing, I'll say this. The issue here is not only about the environmental harm, it is also about false advertising. Environmentally conscious consumers might otherwise have purchased low-emission vehicles or hybrids from other dealers, but they relied on the representations made by Volkswagen. And that's where the false advertising claims come into play, because, of course, consumers who wanted to be environmentally conscientious were misled, and they were duped. And let's be clear about the harm then. These so-called clean diesel cars were spewing harmful smog-producing pollutants caused, and they're called nitrogen oxides, into the air at 40 times the legal limit. Mary will talk more about that, but the harm is significant, especially when we know in California about 35 million people, 35 million Californians, are living in areas currently that lead the nation for ozone and fine particulate pollution, and breathe some of the worst air in the country. So this conduct was only exasperating, was only making worse this problem instead of mitigating. And that's why, in addition to the estimated $10 billion that Volkswagen must spend on consumer relief, they are also required to spend a total of $4.7 billion for environmental projects and investment in zero-emission technology. So, in conclusion, I will say that I think we have a lot to be proud of. This is, again, I think, an example that the public wants and needs to see of the kind of work that happens every day. By these agencies and by these incredible public servants working collaboratively in the best interest of the consumers of our state. And this is not only about the consumers, this is about the health and well-being of all Californians, current and future generations. So with that, Mary Nichols, please. Thank you.
Thank you. As you've heard, this is a collaboration, and I want to just say a few words about the background and how this came to pass. So the Air Resources Board and our engineers are the ones who uncovered the fraud and figured out how it actually worked. And we immediately brought in the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and, in turn, the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice deserves an enormous amount of credit. And I know the Deputy Attorney General was at the press conference in Washington this morning announcing the overall national settlement. And they really showed tremendous leadership in putting together the case that then enabled us to call in Volkswagen and sit down and begin some very, very tough negotiations with the company. California was an essential party, and the Attorney General's office was a critical member of this negotiating team because this is an air case. It's a Clean Air Act case, but it also is a consumer case. And we had to have that expertise brought together of both elements to be able to bring this to a successful conclusion. I think everyone knows that there's a long history of recall campaigns that have not been all that successful in actually bringing in the vehicles and getting them fixed. And we were determined from the very beginning that every person who had purchased one of these cars would be offered a reasonable opportunity to sell it back to the company, that Volkswagen would have to pay enough to get customers to bring these cars back, but also that if people really loved their cars, and we know there are people who don't want to part with them, that they would not be required to accept a buyout. They would have an opportunity to get it fixed, and then that there would even be some people who probably would decide that they just liked their car fine the way it was and they weren't going to do anything to it. And every one of those situations had to be dealt with, and it is reflected in the structure of the settlement agreement. So Volkswagen is putting up sufficient funds to attract, we believe, the majority of people to bring the cars back in. They will have an opportunity to fix those cars and resell them if they can get the fix approved by both ARB and the EPA. We don't have that yet. We have a process underway where we're examining the potential fixes, but as you can imagine, after the history that we have with this company, we're not about to take anything on faith or trust. We are going to be absolutely certain that any fix that is offered is one that works, that is durable, and that does not adversely affect driving. Now, what that means is that we're not going to be getting 100% of what these cars should have been. We probably will get 85 or 90%, but probably not 100%. So what are we doing about the excess pollution? That is where the $4.7 billion that the Attorney General referred to comes in, because again, in a first for clean air, we are not only looking to mitigate the past harm that was done by the excess emissions, we're also looking to build in a cushion to pay for projects that will mitigate any future ongoing excess emissions of NOx from these vehicles. So we've got it covered on both sides. And we also are doing something that, again, as the Attorney General mentioned, is laying the groundwork for a vast expansion of zero-emission vehicles in the state of California. This is a brand-neutral program. Volkswagen is making the investment because they have taken the position they want to go into the business themselves of making electric vehicles. They're determined they're going to reposition themselves as a company that is in the zero emission vehicle space, and that's great. But regardless of what they do in terms of their own product line, they are going to be required to spend money expanding the availability of charging structures, charging facilities, and other useful infrastructure for zero-emission vehicles. So this is really an amazing deal for the California consumers and for the people of the nation as a whole. We're very proud that California was able to play a critical role in it.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Mary.